They told Marcus Webb the F-4 Phantom was completely gutted, stripped of every classified system, before being sold as scrap metal to civilians who wanted oversized lawn ornaments or conversation pieces for their driveways. But when he climbed into the cockpit 3 days after buying it for $8,000, he found equipment that was still powered on, still receiving signals, and still transmitting data to somewhere he couldn't identify, which meant either the military had made a catastrophic mistake, or someone had been using this supposedly decommissioned fighter jet for purposes that were never supposed to see daylight. He bought a retired fighter jet, then found something still working inside, something that connected him to his missing brother's final flight 23 years ago, and exposed a surveillance program that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. Before we get into this unbelievable story, smash that subscribe button right now and tell us what state you're watching from in the comments. We love hearing from our viewers. Now let's dive in. Marcus Webb was 49 years old and owned a small aviation museum in Bakersfield, California, the kind of place that attracted school field trips and aviation enthusiasts, but barely made enough money to keep the lights on. He'd spent 25 years as a Navy aircraft mechanic before retiring, and opening the museum with money he'd saved, and dreams he'd nurtured about preserving the history of flight for people who'd never experienced the raw power of military aviation. The museum had 12 aircraft, mostly Vietnam-era helicopters and trainers that he'd acquired over the years from government surplus auctions, each one carefully restored to display condition, even though none of them would ever fly again. The government surplus auction in March 2024 offered something Marcus had been dreaming about for years, an F-4 Phantom II, the legendary fighter jet that had dominated the skies over Vietnam and served in multiple branches of the military for nearly 4 decades. The listing described it as completely demilitarized, all weapon systems removed, all classified avionics stripped out, all sensitive technology rendered inoperable per Department of Defense protocols that governed the sale of tactical aircraft to civilian buyers. Starting bid was $5,000 for what amounted to 38,000 pounds of aluminum and titanium shaped like the most beautiful aircraft Marcus had ever seen. He wasn't the only bidder. 3 other aviation museums and a private collector from Texas all wanted the Phantom, but Marcus had done his research and knew exactly how high he could go before the purchase became financially irresponsible. The bidding climbed quickly, $5,000 to $6,000 to $7,000, the Texas collector dropping out at $7,500 with a disgusted shake of his head that suggested he thought everyone else was overpaying for scrap metal. The other museums fell away one by one until it was just Marcus and a representative from a facility in Ohio, and when the Ohio Museum hit their limit at $7,800, Marcus raised his paddle one final time. $8,000, the auctioneer called, his voice echoing through the warehouse where dozens of surplus military vehicles sat waiting for new owners. Going once, going twice, sold to Paddle 42. Marcus signed the paperwork in a small office that smelled like motor oil and old coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he wrote a check that represented a significant chunk of his museum's annual budget. The clerk processing the sale was young and disinterested, barely glancing at the forms as she stamped them with the kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested she'd done this thousands of times and found each transaction equally boring. "The aircraft will be delivered to your facility within 2 weeks," she said without looking up. "Standard transport costs apply, and you'll need to provide proof of insurance before we release it." Marcus drove home to Bakersfield with his mind already planning where he'd position the Phantom in his museum, probably near the entrance where it would be the first thing visitors saw, a symbol of American air power that would draw crowds and maybe, just maybe, generate enough additional revenue to keep his struggling business alive for another few years. He didn't sleep much over the next 2 weeks, spending his nights researching the Phantom's history, reading about its combat record in Vietnam, studying the specific tail number of the aircraft he'd purchased and trying to find information about where it had served and who had flown it. The tail number was 14278, and according to military records he found through online databases and Freedom of Information Act requests he'd filed years ago for other projects, this particular Phantom had served with the Navy from 1969 through 1983, flying combat missions over Vietnam, and later serving as a training aircraft at Naval Air Station Miramar in California. The records showed it had been officially decommissioned in 1991, placed in storage at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where thousands of retired military aircraft sat baking in the desert sun, and then sold at auction in 2024 after sitting untouched for 33 years. But there was something odd about the records that Marcus noticed during his late-night research sessions, a gap in the aircraft's service history between 1991 and 1993, where official documents showed conflicting information. Some records indicated the Phantom had been in storage the entire time, while others suggested it had been temporarily reactivated for unspecified purposes before being permanently mothballed. Marcus had seen similar discrepancies in records for other aircraft over the years, usually the result of bureaucratic errors or poor record-keeping during the chaos of post-Cold War military downsizing, but something about this particular gap bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. The Phantom arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in early April, transported on a massive flatbed truck that had to navigate carefully through Bakersfield streets to reach Marcus's museum on the outskirts of town. A small crane lifted the aircraft off the truck and positioned it exactly where Marcus had cleared space near the museum entrance, and for the first time, he was able to walk around his purchase and fully appreciate what $8,000 had bought him. The Phantom was massive, 63 feet long with a wingspan of 38 feet. Its distinctive nose angled upward in the aggressive stance that had made it one of the most recognizable fighters of the Cold War era. The paint was faded and weathered from decades of desert storage, gray and white camouflage that had once been sharp and military precise, but now looked tired and aged, like everything else that had survived from a war that ended before most Americans alive today had even been born. The canopy was intact but scratched and clouded. The landing gear showed signs of rust but was structurally sound, and the twin-engine nacelles were empty and silent, stripped of the massive turbojets that had once pushed this aircraft past Mach 2. Marcus spent that first day just cleaning the exterior, washing away 33 years of accumulated dust and grime, polishing the canopy until he could see into the cockpit, checking the control surfaces to ensure they moved freely for display purposes, even though they'd never need to function again. As the afternoon sun began dropping toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the museum grounds, he finally climbed the crew ladder and settled into the pilot seat for the first time, his hands resting on controls that hadn't been touched in decades. The cockpit was surprisingly intact for an aircraft that was supposed to have been completely demilitarized. The instrument panel still held dozens of gauges and switches, even though Marcus knew they'd all been rendered inoperative before the aircraft was cleared for civilian sale. The ejection seat had been disabled, its explosive charges removed and replaced with inert mechanisms that would never fire, and the radar scope that should have displayed targeting information was dark and dead, just a blank circular screen that reflected Marcus's own face back at him in the fading light. But it was the communications panel that caught his attention, a section of the cockpit that should have been completely empty according to demilitarization protocols. Instead of blank spaces where radios and encryption equipment should have been removed, Marcus found himself looking at gear that appeared not only intact, but surprisingly modern. Digital displays that didn't match the analog technology the Phantom had been equipped with during its service years, and a small black box tucked beneath the panel that had no business being in an aircraft that had supposedly been sitting in desert storage since 1991. Marcus reached out slowly and touched one of the digital displays, not really expecting anything to happen, and nearly fell out of the ejection seat when the screen flickered to life, glowing with a soft green luminescence that seemed impossibly bright in the darkening cockpit. Numbers scrolled across the display, coordinates and frequency readings and data streams that Marcus's aircraft mechanic brain recognized as active communications traffic, signals being received and processed and retransmitted in real time. This equipment wasn't just intact, it was powered on, it was functioning, and it was doing something that decommissioned aircraft sold to civilian museums were absolutely, categorically, never supposed to be capable of doing. Marcus sat frozen in the pilot's seat, his mind trying to process what he was seeing, trying to understand how equipment that should have been stripped out decades ago was not only present, but actively operating, and trying very hard not to think about the most obvious and terrifying explanation, that someone had been using this aircraft for surveillance purposes, that the Phantom sitting in his museum wasn't really decommissioned at all, and that his $8,000 purchase had just made him the unwitting owner of classified military equipment that was still collecting intelligence on someone or something. He was so focused on the glowing display that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching across the museum grounds, didn't notice the figure that had climbed the crew ladder until a voice spoke from directly behind him. startling him so badly that his hand slammed against the control stick and nearly activated the canopy mechanism. "I see you found it," the voice said, male and calm and somehow familiar in a way that made Marcus's stomach tighten with a feeling that wasn't quite fear, but was definitely close. "I was hoping you wouldn't look too closely for at least a few more days, but I suppose that was optimistic, given your background." Marcus turned slowly in the ejection seat to find a man standing on the ladder, silhouetted against the evening sky in a way that made it hard to see his features clearly. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, his hand instinctively moving toward the communications panel as if he could somehow protect the equipment from whoever this intruder was. "How did you get in here?" The man climbed higher on the ladder, bringing his face into the light that spilled from the cockpit displays, and Marcus felt his entire world tilt sideways because the face he was looking at belonged to someone who was supposed to be dead. Someone who'd been officially declared killed in action 23 years ago during a training exercise that had never been fully explained. Someone whose loss had defined Marcus's entire adult life and shaped every decision he'd made since the day the Navy had delivered the news that changed everything. "Hello, Marcus," the man said, and his voice carried the weight of 2 decades of secrets and silence. "I'm sorry I've been dead for so long, but I need you to listen very carefully, because the people who faked my death are going to realize you found this equipment. And when they do, they're going to come for both of us, and we have maybe 48 hours to figure out how to stay alive long enough to expose what they've been doing with these supposedly decommissioned aircraft." The man was David Webb, Marcus's younger brother, and he was very much not dead despite the official records that said otherwise, and the communications equipment glowing in the darkness of the Phantom's cockpit was apparently connected to a conspiracy that had kept David in hiding for 23 years. And had just pulled Marcus into a nightmare he didn't understand and wasn't sure he'd survive. Marcus Webb stared at his brother's face in the green glow of the cockpit instruments, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were clearly seeing, because David had died in 1993 during a training flight off the coast of San Diego, his F-4 Phantom experiencing catastrophic mechanical failure and plunging into the Pacific Ocean before he could eject. His body never recovered despite 3 weeks of intensive search operations that had found only scattered debris and an oil slick that marked where the aircraft had gone down. The Navy had held a memorial service with an empty casket. Their mother had received folded flags and condolences from officers who spoke about honor and sacrifice, and Marcus had spent 23 years living with the guilt of surviving when his younger brother hadn't. "You're not real," Marcus heard himself say, his voice sounding distant and strange like it belonged to someone else. "You're dead. I went to your funeral." "You went to a performance," David replied, climbing fully into the cockpit and settling into the weapons officer's seat behind Marcus, with the easy familiarity of someone who'd spent thousands of hours in this exact position. "A very convincing performance, orchestrated by people who needed me to disappear so completely that even my own family would believe I was gone." He reached forward and tapped the communications panel. "This equipment is why I'm supposed to be dead. This and 27 other aircraft just like this one, scattered across civilian museums and private collections all over the country." Marcus felt like he was dreaming or having a psychotic break, or possibly both, his hands gripping the control stick so tightly his knuckles had gone white as he tried to anchor himself to something solid, while his entire understanding of the past 2 decades crumbled around him. "What are you talking about? What equipment? What aircraft?" David pulled out a small device that looked like a modified tablet and connected it to the communications panel with a cable that seemed designed specifically for this purpose, his movements quick and practiced like he'd done this hundreds of times before. In 1991, the Navy started decommissioning F-4 Phantoms, he explained, while data began flowing across his tablet's screen. Official story was budget cuts after the Cold War ended, newer aircraft making the Phantom obsolete, standard military downsizing, but that was only partly true. The real reason was that someone high up in naval intelligence realized these aircraft could be repurposed. "Repurposed for what?" "Surveillance," David said simply. "The Phantom has a huge radar cross-section and distinctive profile that makes it perfect for what they needed. They installed modern communications equipment, satellite uplinks, encrypted data transmission systems, and then they sold the aircraft to civilian owners who had no idea they were buying active intelligence gathering platforms." Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications started becoming clear. "You're saying the military has been using civilian-owned aircraft for spying?" "Not the military," David corrected. A program that exists outside normal military channels, funded through black budgets and operated by people who don't officially exist on any organizational chart. They identify aircraft being sold at surplus auctions, install the equipment before sale, and then track where the aircraft ends up. Museums, private collectors, aviation enthusiasts, people who put these planes on display in public spaces where they have unobstructed views of surrounding areas. Surrounding areas like what? Military bases, defense contractors, research facilities, anywhere they want continuous surveillance without the legal complications of getting warrants or approval from oversight committees. David's tablet was filling with data, coordinates and signal strength readings and encrypted transmissions that Marcus couldn't begin to interpret. This particular Phantom has been collecting intelligence on Edwards Air Force Base for the past 15 years, ever since it was sold to a private collector in Palmdale, who kept it in his backyard until he died, and his estate auctioned it off. "And you know this how?" Marcus demanded, his shock starting to give way to anger at being lied to for 23 years. "How long have you been alive and watching me grieve for you?" David's expression tightened with something that looked like pain. "I've been dead since April 7th, 1993. The day my aircraft was sabotaged and I was given a choice between actually dying when it crashed into the ocean or agreeing to disappear completely and help expose the surveillance program from the inside." He met Marcus's eyes. "I chose to disappear because they told me if I didn't, they'd kill you and Mom and everyone else who might ask uncomfortable questions about why a perfectly maintained aircraft suddenly experienced total hydraulic failure 30 seconds after takeoff." "Who told you that?" "People who've been running this program since the early 90s, people who've killed at least 6 other pilots who discovered the equipment and tried to report it through official channels. People who have enough power to fake deaths and manipulate official records and make anyone who threatens them simply cease to exist." David disconnected his tablet and looked around the cockpit like he was seeing it for the first time in years. "I've spent 23 years tracking these aircraft, documenting the surveillance, collecting evidence, and trying to find someone I could trust with the information who had enough credibility to be believed when they went public. And you chose me," Marcus said bitterly. "Your dead brother who runs a failing museum and has no political connections or media contacts or any way to fight people who can fake deaths and kill pilots. I chose you because you bought this specific aircraft, which means either you're incredibly lucky or someone wanted you to buy it. And either way, we're both in danger now because the moment this equipment powered on in a new location, it sent an alert to the people monitoring the network." "What kind of alert?" "The kind that tells them their covert surveillance platform has been moved to an unauthorized location and may have been discovered." David stood up as much as the cramped cockpit allowed and looked out over the museum grounds that were now completely dark, except for a few security lights Marcus kept on overnight. "They'll send someone to check. Probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. Someone who'll claim to be from the Defense Department doing a routine inspection of demilitarized aircraft to ensure all classified systems were properly removed. And when they get here, they'll see that the equipment is still intact and powered on. They'll realize you've discovered it, and they'll have to decide whether you're someone who can be threatened into silence or someone who needs to be eliminated." He looked at Marcus. "Given that I'm here talking to you, which means you've now been exposed to classified information by a person who's supposed to be dead, I'm guessing they'll choose elimination." Marcus felt cold despite the warm California evening air that drifted through the open cockpit. "We need to go to the authorities. FBI, CIA, Congress, someone who can investigate this properly." David laughed without humor. "Marcus, the people running this program are the authorities. They have security clearances higher than God, access to intelligence networks that span the globe, and a track record of making problems disappear so thoroughly that nobody even remembers there was a problem. Going to official channels is how the 6 dead pilots ended up dead. Then what do? We document everything," David said, pulling out what looked like a portable hard drive from his jacket. "We download all the data this aircraft has collected over the past 15 years. We photograph the equipment. We create redundant backups and distribute them to people who will release the information if anything happens to us. And then we go public in a way that's so loud and so undeniable that making us disappear would only prove we were telling the truth." The sound of a car engine in the distance made both brothers freeze. David killed the cockpit displays with a quick series of button presses, plunging them into darkness, and pulled Marcus down below the canopy rail. "Could be nothing," he whispered. "Could be a late-night visitor to your museum. Or could be them, arriving faster than I expected, Because someone's been monitoring your research into this aircraft's history and knew you'd eventually look in the right place. Marcus's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears as he crouched in the darkness of the cockpit, pressed against equipment that wasn't supposed to exist, next to a brother who was supposed to be dead, waiting to see if the approaching vehicle contained curious visitors or professional killers sent to ensure that the surveillance program's secrets stayed buried. Through the scratched canopy, he could see headlights sweeping across the museum grounds, a large SUV pulling up to the entrance gate that Marcus always locked at sunset, and even from this distance, he could see the vehicle had government plates. 2 people emerged from the SUV, both wearing dark suits despite the hour, both moving with the controlled precision of people who were trained for violence, but preferred to avoid it when possible. One of them produced what looked like an official identification badge and held it up to the gate's security camera, and Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket with an alert from his security system indicating someone was requesting access to the property. "Don't answer it," David warned. "Let them think you're not here. Maybe they'll just do a perimeter check and leave." But Marcus's phone kept buzzing, and then the security system's speaker crackled to life with a woman's voice that sounded professional and patient, and utterly certain she would be obeyed. "Mr. Webb, this is Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the Defense Intelligence Agency. We have reason to believe you've recently acquired military property that may contain classified systems that weren't properly removed during decommissioning. We need to conduct an immediate inspection to ensure national security hasn't been compromised. Please open the gate." David's hand clamped down on Marcus's arm hard enough to bruise. "Do not open that gate. Do not acknowledge them. We need time to get out of here and get to somewhere public where they can't disappear us without witnesses." But even as he spoke, the woman at the gate was speaking again, and this time her voice carried an edge that suggested patience was running thin. "Mr. Webb, we can see from your security system that you're receiving these alerts. We can also see that the F-4 Phantom you purchased 3 weeks ago has active communications equipment that's been transmitting classified intelligence data. We're not here to harm you. We're here to ensure that equipment is properly secured and to answer any questions you might have about what you've discovered." "She's lying," David hissed. "That's exactly what they told the 6 pilots before they died. Standard protocol is to make initial contacts sound reasonable and helpful, get the target to let their guard down, and then eliminate the threat quietly. How do you know their protocols?" "Because I've been documenting them for 23 years, and I've seen the files on every person who's discovered this program and what happened to them afterward." David was already moving, crawling out of the cockpit with the kind of silent efficiency that suggested he'd spent years learning how to move without being detected. "We go out the back, take your truck, drive to Los Angeles, and hole up somewhere public while we figure out our next move." Marcus followed his brother down the crew ladder, his mind still reeling from revelations that had come too fast to fully process, and together they moved through the darkness of the museum grounds, past helicopters and trainers and historical aircraft that suddenly seemed sinister in a way they never had before. Any of them could have been equipped with surveillance gear. Any of them could have been watching and listening and transmitting data to people who operated in shadows and made problems vanish. They reached Marcus's truck, parked behind the museum's maintenance hangar, and David was reaching for the passenger door when the night exploded with brilliant white light, spotlights from multiple directions pinning them like insects, and the woman's voice that had been professional and patient at the gate was now amplified through a loudspeaker and stripped of all pretense of friendliness. "David Webb and Marcus Webb, remain exactly where you are with your hands visible. You're both in violation of federal law regarding unauthorized access to classified systems, and you're both under arrest, pending investigation into possible espionage activities. Any attempt to flee will be met with appropriate force." Marcus raised his hand slowly, his eyes adjusting to the spots that danced across his vision from the sudden brightness, and he could see now that they were surrounded. At least 6 agents positioned around the perimeter with weapons drawn, professional and calm and utterly certain of their ability to control this situation. Next to him, David hadn't raised his hands, and Marcus could see his brother calculating odds, measuring distances, trying to find an escape route that probably didn't exist. "Don't," Marcus said quietly. "Don't get us killed over this." David's hands slowly rose, and the tension that had been building toward violence suddenly deflated into something sadder and more resigned. "I'm sorry," he said. his voice barely audible beneath the sound of agents approaching with zip-tie restraints. I thought I had more time. I thought we could do this smart and careful and actually survive long enough to expose them. I was wrong. Special Agent Martinez approached, flanked by 2 other agents, her weapon holstered now that the situation was contained. "David Webb," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite triumph or satisfaction, but was definitely recognition. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." They were separated immediately. Marcus pushed into the back of one SUV while David was loaded into another, both vehicles pulling away from the museum with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested this extraction had been planned and rehearsed long before tonight. Marcus watched through the tinted window as his museum disappeared into the darkness behind them, the F4 Phantom still sitting near the entrance like a monument to mistakes and secrets, and he wondered if he'd ever see the place again, or if this was how his life ended, arrested for crimes he didn't understand by agents working for an organization he'd never heard of until 20 minutes ago. The drive lasted nearly 2 hours, winding through Bakersfield and then onto the interstate heading south, the SUV's interior silent except for the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional crackle of encrypted radio traffic that Marcus couldn't decipher. Special Agent Martinez sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at him with an expression that Marcus couldn't read, something between professional assessment and what might have been sympathy, though he couldn't imagine why someone who'd just arrested him would feel sympathetic. They pulled off the interstate somewhere near Los Angeles, navigating through industrial areas that all looked identical in the darkness, warehouses and shipping facilities and businesses that had closed hours ago, until finally stopping at a building that could have been anything from the outside, unmarked and unremarkable and exactly the kind of place where people could be brought and questioned without anyone noticing or caring. Marcus was escorted inside by 2 agents who never spoke or made eye contact, through corridors that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, past doors that were numbered but gave no indication of what lay behind them, until finally he was placed in a small room with concrete walls, a metal table and 2 chairs that were bolted to the floor. The room was cold in the way that interrogation rooms always were in movies, designed to keep people uncomfortable and off balance, though Marcus suspected the real purpose of the temperature was simply that whoever controlled the building's climate didn't care about the comfort of people who'd been arrested in the middle of the night for discovering things they weren't supposed to know about. He sat in one of the bolted chairs and waited, his mind replaying everything David had told him in the Phantom's cockpit, trying to organize information that felt simultaneously too unbelievable to be true and too specific to be fabricated. Special Agent Martinez entered after what Marcus's watch told him was 37 minutes but what felt like hours, carrying a thick folder and a tablet computer that she set on the table between them, before settling into the chair across from him. She studied him for a long moment without speaking, her dark eyes moving across his face like she was reading a book written in a language only she understood. "Mr. Webb," she finally said, her voice carrying none of the edge it had held when she'd arrested him, just professional neutrality that could have meant anything or nothing. "You're not under arrest despite what I said at your museum. That was theater designed to secure the situation quickly and safely. You're here because you've stumbled into something classified, and we need to determine whether you're a threat to national security or a victim of circumstances beyond your control." Marcus felt anger cutting through his confusion and fear. "You arrested me at gunpoint and drove me to an unmarked facility in the middle of the night. That's not how you treat victims. That's how we treat people who've been in contact with David Webb, a person of interest in multiple ongoing investigations who's been evading federal authorities for 23 years. Martinez opened the folder and pulled out photographs, surveillance images that showed David in various locations over the past 2 decades, different haircuts and different clothes, but always the same careful awareness in his eyes. The look of someone who knew he was being hunted and had learned to survive anyway. "Your brother has been interfering with a classified program, stealing sensitive data, and attempting to expose operations that are vital to national security. He told me you've been using civilian-owned aircraft for illegal surveillance," Marcus said, deciding that if he was already in this deep, there was no point in pretending ignorance. "He told me you've killed pilots who discovered the equipment." Martinez's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been surprise or might have been respect for his directness. "What did he tell you about the program's purpose? That you've installed communications gear in supposedly demilitarized aircraft sold to museums and collectors, using them to spy on military installations and defense contractors without warrants or oversight?" And you believed him, a man who's been legally dead for over 2 decades, who appeared out of nowhere with extraordinary claims and no supporting evidence beyond equipment in your aircraft that you have no expertise to evaluate or understand. Marcus thought about the green glow of the displays, about the data streaming across screens that shouldn't have had power, about his brother's face in the darkness carrying the weight of 23 years of secrets. I believed him because he had no reason to lie to me after staying hidden for this long. If he'd wanted money or help escaping, he would have contacted me years ago. He came to warn me that I was in danger because I bought that specific aircraft. Martinez pulled up something on her tablet and turned it so Marcus could see the screen, which displayed what looked like technical specifications for the F-4 Phantom, detailed diagrams showing every system and component with color coding that indicated which parts were original equipment and which had been added later. The aircraft you purchased does contain modern communications equipment, she confirmed. Equipment that was installed not by us but by your brother and others like him, who've been running their own surveillance operation, monitoring the very program they claim to be exposing. The revelation hit Marcus like physical impact, reordering everything David had told him and forcing him to question assumptions he'd made in the confusion and shock of seeing his dead brother alive. You're saying David installed the equipment himself? That he's been using civilian aircraft to spy on your program? We're saying that David Webb and approximately 14 other individuals, all former military personnel with technical expertise and grievances against various intelligence agencies, have been conducting unauthorized surveillance for over 20 years, installing their own equipment in aircraft they knew would be sold to civilian owners, and collecting intelligence on military operations that they have no legal right to access. She pulled up more images showing other aircraft in other museums, each one highlighted to show hidden equipment and unauthorized modifications. Your brother didn't fake his death to expose a conspiracy. He faked his death to escape prosecution for espionage and has been committing additional crimes ever since. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him again, his certainty about who was telling the truth and who was lying becoming less solid with every new piece of information. If that's true, why didn't you arrest him years ago? Why let him run free for 2 decades? Because we've been trying to identify everyone involved in his network, everyone who's been receiving the intelligence he collects, and everyone who might be funding or supporting his operations. Martinez closed the folder and leaned forward slightly. Your brother is not a whistleblower, Mr. Webb. He's a traitor who's been selling classified information to foreign governments, and you've just become his latest accomplice, whether you intended to or not. I didn't know any of this, Marcus protested. I bought an aircraft at a legal auction. I had no idea it contained anything classified. We believe you, which is why you're sitting in this room having a conversation instead of being processed into federal custody on espionage charges. But your ignorance doesn't change the fact that you now possess classified equipment and information, which means you have 2 choices. She held up one finger. Cooperate fully with our investigation. Tell us everything your brother said. Help us locate him and dismantle his network, and walk away from this with your life intact. She held up a second finger. Or refuse to cooperate. Claim your brother is the hero and we're the villains, and spend the next 20 years in a federal prison while lawyers argue about whether your actions constitute espionage or just catastrophic stupidity. Those aren't choices, Marcus said. That's coercion. That's reality in a world where national security sometimes requires hard decisions and uncomfortable compromises. Martinez stood up and walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. I'm going to give you 30 minutes to think about which choice you want to make. There's water in the corner if you're thirsty. When I come back, we'll either start building a cooperation agreement or we'll start processing your arrest. She left, and Marcus was alone in the cold room with his thoughts chasing themselves in circles, trying to determine who was lying and who was telling the truth in a situation where everyone seemed to have reasons to deceive him. David had appeared out of nowhere after 23 years with claims about government surveillance and assassination programs, but he'd also had technical knowledge about the equipment and specific details about aircraft that would be hard to fabricate. Martinez presented herself as a federal agent protecting national security, but she'd also arrested him at gunpoint and brought him to an unmarked facility in the middle of the night, which was exactly what David had warned would happen. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket, which surprised him because he'd assumed they would have confiscated it when they arrested him, but apparently either they'd forgotten or they wanted to see who he might try to contact. He pulled it out carefully, expecting to see a message from his museum's security system or maybe a concerned friend who'd noticed he wasn't home, but instead found a text from an unknown number that contained only a photograph and a single line of text. The photograph showed Special Agent Martinez shaking hands with a man in a military uniform, both of them standing in front of an F-4 Phantom that Marcus recognized because he'd spent hours studying its tail number during his research. It was 14278, the exact aircraft now sitting in his museum. The text below the image read, "Her name isn't Martinez and she doesn't work for DIA. She works for the people who killed 6 pilots and faked my death. Don't trust anything she tells you. David." Marcus stared at the message, his hands shaking slightly as the implications crashed over him in waves. Either David was telling the truth, and Marcus was currently being interrogated by the very people who'd been running the illegal surveillance program, or David was lying and had somehow fabricated a photograph designed to make Marcus distrust federal agents who were actually trying to help him. Both scenarios seemed equally plausible and equally terrifying, and Marcus had no way to determine which was true based on information available to him in a locked interrogation room with no access to outside verification. The door opened and Martinez, if that was even her real name, stepped back inside carrying 2 bottles of water and what looked like legal documents. She set everything on the table and settled back into her chair, studying Marcus's face with that same unreadable expression she'd worn earlier. "Have you made a decision?" Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket without letting her see the screen. "I have questions first." "Of course you do," she said, unscrewing one of the water bottles and taking a long drink. "Ask anything you want. Transparency builds trust. Show me your credentials, the real ones, not just a badge. I want to see identification that proves you are who you say you are, and that you work for the agency you claim to represent." Martinez smiled, a small expression that could have meant appreciation for his caution or amusement at his naivety. She pulled out a leather case and laid it open on the table, displaying a Defense Intelligence Agency badge with her photograph and a name that read, Sarah Martinez, Special Agent, along with a serial number and security clearance level that Marcus had no way to verify as authentic or fabricated. "Could be real. Could be an excellent fake," Marcus said. "I need something more than a laminated card that anyone with the right equipment could produce." "Smart," Martinez acknowledged. She pulled out her phone and made a call, holding it so Marcus could hear both sides of the conversation. "This is Martinez, badge serial 77423. I need verbal confirmation of my identity for a witness who's requesting verification." A male voice on the other end responded immediately. "Agent Sarah Martinez, Defense Intelligence Agency, assigned to Special Access Programs Division. Current posting classified. Security clearance top secret/SCI. Verification code Alpha. November 774. Martinez ended the call and looked at Marcus. "Satisfied?" "Not really," Marcus admitted. "Because David told me you'd have exactly this kind of verification ready, that you'd be able to produce credentials and make phone calls and present everything that looks official, because that's how deep cover operations work when they're trying to deceive someone who's asking uncomfortable questions." Martinez set her phone down slowly, and for the first time since entering the room, her professional mask slipped enough for Marcus to see something underneath that looked like genuine frustration. "Mr. Webb, if I wanted to deceive you, I wouldn't be sitting here answering questions. I'd have drugged your water, extracted the information I needed through chemical interrogation, and disposed of you in a way that made your disappearance look like an unfortunate accident." She leaned forward. "The fact that we're having this conversation at all should tell you that we actually do care about legal protocols and proper procedures, even when dealing with people who've stumbled into classified programs. Unless the reason you're talking instead of drugging me is because you need information I don't even know I have," Marcus countered. "David said you'd try to convince me I was wrong to trust him, that you'd present yourselves as the good guys following proper procedures while actually working for the people who've been running an illegal surveillance network and killing anyone who threatens to expose it. Your brother has had 23 years to craft a narrative that makes him the hero and makes us the villains," Martinez said, her voice hardening slightly. "He's had 23 years to develop contingency plans and backup stories, and ways to manipulate people who are vulnerable to emotional appeals about government conspiracies and whistleblower persecution. What he hasn't had is any actual evidence to support his claims, because if he did, He would have released it years ago instead of hiding in shadows and sending cryptic messages to family members he supposedly cares about. The door to the interrogation room opened without warning, and a new person entered, a man in his 60s wearing a suit that probably cost more than Marcus earned in a month, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room he walked into. Martinez stood immediately, her body language shifting to something that looked like deference mixed with caution. "Director Carrington," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I wasn't expecting you to be involved directly in this case." "Plans change," Carrington replied, his attention already fixed on Marcus with an intensity that was almost physical. "Mr. Webb, your brother just made this situation significantly more complicated, and we need to have a very frank conversation about what happens next." Director Carrington settled into the chair that Martinez had vacated, his movements deliberate and controlled in a way that suggested he never did anything without carefully considering every possible consequence. Martinez remained standing near the door, her posture rigid and professional, but Marcus noticed the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested even she wasn't entirely comfortable with her superior's unexpected arrival. Carrington pulled out a tablet from his briefcase and set it on the table between them, the screen dark and reflective, showing only Marcus's own worried face staring back at him. 30 minutes ago, Carrington began without preamble. Your brother uploaded approximately 4 terabytes of classified data to 17 different servers scattered across 12 countries. The uploads were simultaneous, coordinated, and designed to ensure that even if we manage to shut down some of the servers, the information will remain accessible through others. He tapped the tablet and the screen came to life, displaying what looked like a network diagram with nodes spreading across a map of the world. "This is what catastrophic intelligence failure looks like, Mr. Webb, and your brother just triggered the worst breach of classified information since Edward Snowden." Marcus felt his stomach drop, understanding that whatever chance he'd had of walking away from this situation quietly had just evaporated, along with any illusion that David's actions were those of a careful whistleblower trying to expose wrongdoing through proper channels. "What kind of data?" "Everything he's collected over 23 years, Carrington replied, scrolling through lists of files that filled the tablet screen faster than Marcus could read them. "Communications intercepts from the aircraft surveillance program your brother told you about. Personnel files on intelligence officers working in classified positions. Technical specifications for weapons systems that are supposed to remain secret for another decade. Operational details on ongoing missions in 7 different countries." He looked up from the tablet, his expression grim. "Your brother didn't just expose the program he claimed to be investigating. He exposed everything he could get his hands on, and he did it in a way that ensures maximum damage to American intelligence capabilities worldwide." "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I don't know where David is. I don't know how to stop him. I didn't even know he was alive until a few hours ago." "Because 3 minutes after initiating the uploads, your brother sent a message to multiple news organizations, government officials, and foreign intelligence agencies." Carrington brought up a new file on the tablet, this one showing what looked like an email with a subject line that read, "The truth about American surveillance overreach and the cost of exposing it." The message claims that he's been hunted for 23 years by a rogue intelligence unit that operates outside legal oversight, that he's documented evidence of domestic surveillance programs that violate constitutional protections, and that if anything happens to him, additional classified data will be automatically released. It's a dead man's switch designed to ensure we can't simply eliminate him without consequences. Marcus thought about the text message he'd received earlier, the photograph of Martinez with the F-4 Phantom, David's warning not to trust anything the agents told him. "So what do you want from me?" "Your brother included you in his message," Carrington said, turning the tablet so Marcus could read the relevant section. "He claims that you're an innocent civilian who discovered the surveillance equipment by accident, that you're now being held by the same people who faked his death, and that any confession or statement you make while in our custody should be considered coerced and invalid." He paused, letting that sink in. "He's using you as a human shield, Mr. Webb, protecting himself by making it politically impossible for us to prosecute you without appearing to prove his conspiracy theories correct. But that also means you can't just make me disappear," Marcus said, understanding beginning to dawn. "If I die or vanish, it supports David's narrative. If I'm prosecuted, it looks like retaliation against a whistleblower's family, You need me to voluntarily contradict his claims, to go on record saying he's lying about the surveillance program and that I've been treated properly. Exactly, Carrington confirmed. Which is why I'm here to offer you a deal that's substantially more generous than the cooperation agreement Agent Martinez was prepared to present. He pulled out a document that had been printed on official-looking letterhead, multiple pages stapled together with tabs marking sections that required signatures. We will drop all potential charges against you. We will allow you to keep your museum and the F-4 Phantom, though we'll remove the surveillance equipment and properly demilitarize the aircraft. We will provide you with a financial settlement of $250,000 as compensation for the disruption to your business and your cooperation with our investigation. And in exchange, you make a public statement saying that your brother is mentally unstable, that his claims about government surveillance and assassination programs are delusions, and that during your brief interaction with him, he seemed paranoid and disconnected from reality. You testify before a closed congressional committee that we treated you professionally and respectfully, and you assist us in locating your brother by providing any information about his habits, contacts, or possible hiding places that might help us apprehend him before he causes additional damage. Marcus read through the agreement carefully, his years of running a small business having taught him never to sign anything without understanding every clause and implication. The language was precise and legal, offering substantial benefits in exchange for his cooperation, but buried in the middle sections were provisions that would effectively prevent him from ever speaking publicly about what he'd discovered in the Phantom's cockpit, or what David had told him about the surveillance program. He'd be bound by non-disclosure agreements that carried criminal penalties for violation, essentially buying his freedom and financial security by agreeing to help bury his brother's revelations. What if I refuse? Marcus asked, looking up from the document to meet Carrington's steady gaze. Then we proceed with prosecution on charges of unauthorized possession of classified materials, conspiracy to commit espionage, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Carrington's voice remained calm and professional, delivering threats with the same tone he might use to discuss weather forecasts. You'll spend the next 5 to 7 years in federal prison while your museum goes bankrupt and your reputation is destroyed. When you're eventually released, you'll be a convicted felon with no assets, no prospects, and a brother who's either dead or in custody, having accomplished nothing except ruining both of your lives. Martinez spoke from her position near the door, her voice softer than Carrington's but no less certain. For what it's worth, Mr. Webb, I believe you when you say you didn't know about any of this before tonight. But belief doesn't change the reality of your situation. You possess classified information. You've been in contact with a wanted fugitive. Under national security law, those facts alone are sufficient for prosecution, regardless of your intent or knowledge. Marcus set the agreement down and looked at both of them. These people who claimed to represent lawful authority and proper procedure, but who were also offering him money to lie about his brother and help cover up whatever truth David had been trying to expose for 23 years. What if David's telling the truth? What if there really is an illegal surveillance program? What if pilots really were killed for discovering it? Then your brother should have reported it through proper whistleblower channels instead of faking his death and spending 2 decades stealing classified information. Carrington replied, "The law provides protections for people who expose wrongdoing through appropriate procedures. Your brother chose to operate outside those procedures, which makes him a criminal regardless of whether his underlying claims have any merit. But if he'd reported it through proper channels, would anyone have listened? Would anything have changed? Or would he have been silenced and discredited and made to disappear just like he claims? Those are hypothetical questions about a situation that didn't happen," Carrington said. "What did happen is that your brother committed espionage, and you're currently in possession of evidence of his crimes. The only question is whether you're willing to be part of the solution or whether you prefer to be part of the problem." Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket again. Another message from David's unknown number, and this time he pulled it out openly since they clearly knew he had it and had apparently decided not to confiscate it. The message contained a link and brief text. "Live stream starting in 2 minutes. Watch before you sign anything. David." "What is it?" Martinez asked, moving closer to see his screen. Marcus clicked the link, which opened a video player showing a countdown timer and a message indicating the stream would begin shortly. "I think we're about to find out what David uploaded." Carrington's expression went from controlled annoyance to genuine concern. He pulled out his own phone and made a rapid call, his voice sharp with authority. I need the cyber team to trace and shut down a live stream that's about to begin. Sending you the link now. Priority Alpha, full resources. Do it immediately. But even as he spoke, the countdown reached 0 and David's face appeared on Marcus's phone screen. His brother looking tired, but determined, sitting in what appeared to be a generic hotel room that could have been anywhere in the world. The video quality was professional, clearly using good equipment and lighting, and in the corner of the screen was a viewer counter that was already climbing past 10,000 people and accelerating rapidly. "My name is David Webb," his brother said, speaking directly into the camera with the calm certainty of someone who'd rehearsed this moment for years. "I'm a former Navy pilot who was declared killed in action in 1993, after discovering a classified surveillance program that violates constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure. For the past 23 years, I've been collecting evidence of this program, and tonight I'm releasing everything I've found because the American people deserve to know how their government has been spying on them using civilian-owned aircraft and fabricated legal justifications." The viewer count hit 50,000 and kept climbing. Carrington was shouting into his phone about shutting down servers and blocking access, but Marcus could tell from his superior's frustrated expression that whatever technical measures were being attempted weren't working fast enough to prevent David's message from spreading. David continued speaking, his presentation methodical and detailed, showing documents and photographs and technical specifications that Marcus recognized from the equipment in the Phantom's cockpit. He explained how the surveillance program worked, naming specific aircraft and their civilian owners, showing maps of what each installation was monitoring, and presenting what he claimed was evidence that the program had been operating without proper legal authorization or congressional oversight for over 20 years. Then David's tone changed, becoming more personal and more directly challenging. "My brother Marcus is currently being held by the people who run this program," he said, looking directly into the camera as if he could see Marcus watching. "They're going to offer him money and immunity if he agrees to say I'm lying, to testify that I'm mentally unstable, to help them maintain the cover-up. Marcus, if you're watching this, I want you to know that I don't blame you if you take their deal. I've been fighting this for 23 years, and I'm tired, and I'm not sure I can win. But I also want you to know that everything I've told you tonight is true, and the evidence I'm releasing will prove it to anyone willing to look objectively at the facts." The stream continued for another 47 minutes, during which David presented what he claimed was documentation of 6 pilots who'd been killed after discovering surveillance equipment, showed communications proving that senior intelligence officials knew about the program and had actively worked to conceal it, and explained his own fake death in detail that included photographs of the sabotaged aircraft and testimony from a mechanic who'd been threatened into silence after questioning why. A perfectly maintained F-4 had experienced catastrophic hydraulic failure. When the stream finally ended, the viewer count had reached over 3 million people, and Marcus could see from Carrington's expression that something fundamental had just shifted in the director's calculations about how this situation could be resolved. The agreement they'd been trying to get Marcus to sign was now worthless because David had preemptively discredited anything Marcus might say against him, and trying to prosecute Marcus would now look exactly like the retaliation David had predicted. "Well," Carrington said quietly, setting his phone down on the table, "that complicates things considerably." Martinez was checking her own phone, scrolling through what looked like news alerts and social media reactions. "It's everywhere," she reported. Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, every major news organization. Congressional offices are already putting out statements calling for investigations. The hashtag Justice for David Webb is trending #1. Marcus looked at the agreement still sitting on the table between them, the document that would have given him money and safety in exchange for betraying his brother and helping maintain a cover-up that was now collapsing in real time. "I'm not signing that," he said. "Whatever happens next, I'm not helping you bury the truth." Carrington studied him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something in the director's eyes that might have been respect, or might have been resignation to inevitable consequences. "Then I suppose we need to have a different conversation about what truth actually means, and whether your brother's version is as accurate as he claims." Director Carrington stood and walked to the corner of the interrogation room where a laptop sat on a small desk that Marcus hadn't noticed before, his movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the chaos that David's livestream had just unleashed across the internet. Martinez remained by the door, her expression unreadable but her body language suggesting she was equally uncertain about what would happen next, now that millions of people knew about the surveillance program and were demanding answers that could no longer be dismissed or delayed through normal bureaucratic channels. "Mr. Webb," Carrington said, opening the laptop and typing rapidly, "your brother just forced my hand in ways that will probably end my career and possibly land me in federal prison, so I'm going to show you something that fewer than 20 people in the entire intelligence community know exists." He turned the screen toward Marcus. "This is the truth your brother thinks he's been exposing, and it's both more complicated and less sinister than his narrative suggests." The screen showed a document dated September 1991, marked with classification levels so high that Marcus didn't even recognize some of the designations, and bearing the signature of someone whose name he did recognize because it had belonged to the President of the United States at that time. The document authorized something called Project Sentinel, described as a domestic surveillance initiative designed to monitor potential terrorist threats in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, when intelligence agencies had become concerned about sleeper cells and foreign agents operating within American borders. "We did install communications equipment in decommissioned aircraft," Carrington confirmed, scrolling through pages of technical specifications and deployment schedules. "We did place those aircraft with civilian owners in strategic locations near military installations and defense contractors, and we did collect intelligence on activities occurring in those areas without obtaining traditional warrants or following standard oversight procedures." "So David was right," Marcus said, feeling vindication and horror mixing in equal measure. "You were running an illegal surveillance program." "Legal, not illegal," Carrington corrected. "The authorization came from the highest level of government, with approval from congressional intelligence committees under provisions of the Patriot Act that allow warrantless surveillance when national security is at immediate risk." He pulled up more documents showing congressional briefings and legal opinions from Justice Department attorneys. "Everything we did had legal justification, even if that justification came from interpretations of law that many people would find troubling or unconstitutional. Then why hide it? Why fake David's death and kill the other pilots who discovered it?" Carrington's expression hardened. "We didn't kill anyone, Mr. Webb. That's the lie your brother has been spreading for 23 years, and it's the reason he's a fugitive instead of a legitimate whistleblower." He brought up new files, accident investigation reports for 6 pilots David had named in his live stream. Every single one of these deaths was investigated thoroughly by independent agencies. Every single one was determined to be accidental, mechanical failure or pilot error or weather conditions, tragic but not criminal. Marcus looked at the reports, seeing official seals and signatures from National Transportation Safety Board investigators, reading conclusions that seemed professionally prepared and thoroughly documented. But David said these pilots all discovered the surveillance equipment shortly before they died. "That's too much coincidence." "It's not coincidence, it's selection bias," Carrington replied. "Your brother identified 6 pilots out of approximately 1,400 who flew F-4 Phantoms during the relevant time period. 6 deaths over 30 years in a high-risk occupation is actually below the statistical average for military aviation. David found patterns in random noise because he was looking for patterns, and then he built an entire conspiracy theory around those patterns without considering that correlation doesn't prove causation." Martinez spoke from the door, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been sympathy. "Your brother's aircraft really did experience hydraulic failure in 1993. The investigation found metal fatigue in a pressure line that had been missed during routine maintenance. It was an accident, tragic and preventable perhaps, but not sabotage and not assassination. Then why did you fake his death instead of just letting him die in the crash?" Marcus demanded. "Because he didn't die in the crash," Carrington said quietly. "He ejected successfully and was recovered by a search and rescue team within 40 minutes. But during his debriefing, he became convinced that the equipment failure had been deliberate, that we'd tried to kill him because he'd been asking questions about surveillance gear he'd noticed in another Phantom. He refused to accept the accident investigation findings, threatened to go public with accusations that would have compromised Project Sentinel, and became increasingly unstable as he developed elaborate theories about assassination programs and cover-ups. So you declared him dead to silence him," Marcus said. "We offered him medical retirement and psychological counseling, which he refused. We offered him reassignment to non-flying positions where his concerns about aircraft safety wouldn't be an issue, which he also refused." Carrington pulled up psychiatric evaluations and medical records. Your brother was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder following his ejection, combined with paranoid ideation and conspiracy, thinking that made him a security risk. The choice was either commit him to a psychiatric facility involuntarily, which would have destroyed his career and reputation, or allow him to voluntarily separate from service and disappear into civilian life where he could get the help he needed. And he chose to disappear and spend 23 years proving you were the villains he believed you to be, Marcus said, understanding finally beginning to crystallize into something that felt closer to truth than either David's version or Carrington's had seemed individually. We gave him separation pay and benefits, Carrington confirmed. We sealed his service records to protect his privacy and reputation. We hoped he'd eventually accept treatment and move on with his life. Instead, he went underground, started his own surveillance operation using the very techniques he accused us of employing illegally, and spent 2 decades collecting information he had no authorization to access and no legal right to possess. Marcus thought about his brother's face on the live stream, the conviction and certainty in David's voice as he presented evidence and made accusations, the appearance of someone telling truth to power rather than someone suffering from decades of untreated mental illness and conspiracy ideation. How much of what David released tonight is actually classified? How much damage did he really do? Approximately 60% of the documents he uploaded contain genuinely classified information about Project Sentinel and related programs, Carrington replied. The other 40% is either misinterpreted public records, fabricated evidence, or speculation presented as fact. The damage assessment is still ongoing, but preliminary analysis suggests he's compromised intelligence sources in at least 7 countries, exposed operational details that will require us to completely restructure several programs, and given foreign intelligence agencies insights into American capabilities that will take years and billions of dollars to mitigate. But some of what he released proves Project Sentinel exists and was monitoring American citizens without warrants, Marcus pressed. That's the truth people are reacting to online right now, not the conspiracy theories about assassinations. Yes, and that's the conversation we're now going to have with Congress and the American people whether we wanted to or not. Carrington closed the laptop and sat back down across from Marcus. Project Sentinel will be shut down. I'll probably resign or be fired. Congressional hearings will examine every aspect of the program, and reforms will be implemented to prevent similar situations in the future. Your brother will be hailed as a whistleblower by some and condemned as a traitor by others, and the truth is he's probably both. A man who discovered real problems but addressed them in ways that were illegal and dangerous. What about me? Marcus asked. Where do I fit in this? That depends on what you want, Carrington said. You can disappear back into your museum and try to pretend this never happened, though David's livestream mentioned you by name, so you'll probably face media attention whether you want it or not. You can cooperate with the congressional investigations and tell the truth about everything you've learned, which will make you an important witness, but also a target for people on both sides who want to control the narrative. Or you can try to find your brother and convince him to come in from the cold before he releases whatever additional classified information he's holding in reserve, which might be the only way to prevent further damage and possibly the only way to get him the help he actually needs. Marcus thought about David's message, the warning not to trust anything these people told him, the photograph showing Martinez with the F-4 Phantom, the elaborate conspiracy David had constructed over 23 years of isolation and paranoia. He thought about Carrington's explanations and documents and the plausible alternative narrative, where his brother was a traumatized pilot who'd never recovered from a near-death experience and had built an entire worldview around the belief that shadowy forces were hunting him. I want to talk to David, Marcus decided, not to convince him to surrender, but to hear his side of this with my own ears now that I've heard yours. Then I'll decide what I believe and what I'm willing to say publicly. Carrington nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the answer he'd been expecting or perhaps hoping for. We can arrange that, though I should warn you that your brother has been evading surveillance for over 2 decades and is exceptionally skilled at remaining hidden. Even with your help, finding him won't be easy. I don't think I need to find him, Marcus said, pulling out his phone and looking at the messages David had sent throughout the night. I think he'll find me because despite everything he's done and everything he believes, he's still my brother. And brothers don't abandon each other even when one of them has spent 23 years living in a world that might not actually exist. 3 days later, Marcus was back at his museum in Bakersfield, standing in front of the F-4 Phantom that had started everything, watching as a team of technicians carefully removed the surveillance equipment David had installed years ago in preparation for it being sold to exactly the kind of civilian owner who would put it on public display near exactly the kind of strategic location that made monitoring valuable. The equipment came out in pieces, modern technology hidden inside vintage aircraft, a physical metaphor for the way David had hidden himself inside a conspiracy theory that was part truth and part delusion and impossible to fully separate without tearing both apart. The media had been relentless. News crews camping outside the museum for 48 hours straight, reporters shouting questions every time Marcus appeared, demanding to know if he supported his brother's revelations or believed the government's denials. Congressional hearings had been announced, Director Carrington had resigned as predicted, and Project Sentinel had been officially terminated with promises of full transparency and accountability that Marcus suspected would ultimately amount to heavily redacted reports and carefully managed disclosures that protected more than they revealed. Marcus was exhausted and overwhelmed and completely unsure what to believe about anything anymore. But he was also certain of one thing. Somewhere out there, David was watching the news coverage and reading the reactions and planning his next move, and eventually his brother would contact him again because that's what the message pattern suggested. David reaching out whenever he needed something, or wanted to deliver new information, or simply required confirmation that someone in the world still cared about him despite everything. The phone call came at 2 a.m. on the fourth night, Marcus's cell phone buzzing with another unknown number, another untraceable connection routing through servers in countries that didn't cooperate with American law enforcement. Marcus answered without hesitation, walking out to the museum grounds where the Phantom sat illuminated by security lights that made it look almost ghostly in the darkness. "Marcus," David's voice said, carrying across the distance and the years and all the lies that had separated them. "I saw Carrington's press conference. I know what they're saying about me, that I'm mentally ill, that the assassinations were accidents, that Project Sentinel had legal authorization even if the law authorizing it was wrong. Is any of that true?" Marcus asked. "Not what they're saying about the program, but what they're saying about you. Are you sick, David? Do you need help?" There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Marcus thought his brother might have hung up. But then David spoke again, and his voice carried something Marcus hadn't heard in any of their previous conversations: uncertainty. The first crack in the absolute conviction that had characterized everything David had said and done since appearing in the Phantom's cockpit. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "I've spent 23 years believing one version of reality, collecting evidence that supported that version, interpreting everything through that lens. Maybe I've been right. Maybe I've been crazy. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between and I'm too close to see it clearly." "Come home," Marcus said. "Not to surrender to them, but to talk to me face to face. Let me help you figure out what's real." "I can't. Not yet. There are still things I need to finish, information I need to verify, people I need to protect from retaliation. But Marcus, I need you to know something. Everything I did, every choice I made for 23 years, was because I believed I was protecting people from a government that had become too powerful and too willing to sacrifice individual rights for collective security. If I was wrong, if I hurt people who didn't deserve it or exposed secrets that should have stayed hidden, I need you to know it wasn't because I didn't care about the consequences. It was because I cared too much and couldn't see past my own certainty to consider I might be mistaken." The line went dead, and Marcus was alone again with the Phantom and his thoughts and the growing understanding that truth in intelligence operations wasn't a simple binary between right and wrong, but a complex spectrum where good people made terrible choices for reasons they believed were justified, and where systems designed to protect sometimes became the very thing they were meant to prevent. 6 months later, the congressional hearings concluded with findings that Project Sentinel had operated in legal gray areas that required new legislation to prevent future overreach, that David Webb had exposed real problems, but had also broken laws that couldn't be excused regardless of his motivations, and that the 6 pilot deaths had been accidents that coincidentally aligned with David's conspiracy theory, but showed no evidence of deliberate criminal action. David remained in hiding, occasionally releasing new information that added details to the surveillance program story, but never quite proved the assassination claims that had been central to his narrative. Marcus kept the museum running, added the F-4 Phantom to his permanent collection with a plaque explaining its history both as a Cold War fighter and as the aircraft that exposed Project Sentinel, and tried to build a life that acknowledged the complexity of what had happened, rather than reducing it to simple heroes and villains. He never heard from David again directly, though occasionally he'd find unmarked envelopes in his mailbox containing photographs of his brother in various locations around the world, always alone, always watching, always certain that the truth he believed in was worth the cost of 23 years in exile and the loss of everything he'd once held dear. And sometimes late at night, Marcus would sit in the Phantom's cockpit and think about brothers and secrets and the price of conviction, about surveillance and security, and the impossibly difficult balance between protecting people and respecting their freedom, and about how buying a retired fighter jet for $8,000 had taught him that truth was often messier and less satisfying than conspiracy, but it was also more important and more worth fighting for than any comfortable lie could ever be. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into surveillance, conspiracy, and the complicated truth between them. If this story made you think about the balance between security and freedom, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more true stories that challenge simple narratives and explore the gray areas where most of life actually happens. Drop a comment with your thoughts on whistleblowers, government surveillance, and where the line should be drawn between national security and individual rights. And remember, sometimes the truth isn't what we want it to be, but it's always what we need to hear.